Welcome to the tutorial for developing extensions for JupyterLab. I'm Martha Cryan. I work for IBM, contributing to JupyterLab and some extensions for JupyterLab called Elira. I'm based here in Austin, and I'm going to be talking about some context for what we're learning about today, talking about what JupyterLab is, what some extension points are, and then giving some examples of what popular extensions are and different ways that they've interacted with JupyterLab as extensions. And then after that, Alex here is going to be talking about how to write a very simple extension and walking you through that, and everyone should get it running on their own machine. And then Piyush is going to go through how to set up debugging in VSCode so that you can debug your code really easily. And at the end, we're going to have a section that's more time for everyone to just write their own extension. And so if you came with your own idea for an extension, that's great, and we'll help you with it. But also as you're watching, if you think of any ideas, that's great, and just keep that in mind. But we'll also have a list of suggested extensions. And in the back is Luciano. He's also going to be helping if you guys have any issues with setting up your environment in Alex's section. Yeah, and then one piece of vocabulary before I get into showing you JupyterLab is I'm going to be talking about core extensions versus third-party or just regular extensions. And what I'm talking about is just that JupyterLab itself is kind of a set of extensions. And I know that sounds abstract, but basically, things like the notebook editor, that's its own extension that is built into JupyterLab when you install it, or the file browser or the code console. Those are all their own extensions, but they're called core extensions because you don't, as a user, install them as an extension. And you'll see kind of what I mean more as I show you JupyterLab's interface. So this is what you see if you haven't used JupyterLab before when you open it up. I'm also keeping in mind that you want to know some terminology that is more useful as an extension author. So some of this might seem obvious, but it's kind of just to say what we call it. This is the main area, and you would add something called a main area widget into it. So that's what I mean. And then there's the side panels where you can have the file browser, and there's a panel on the left and right. And then there's a status bar at the bottom and a set of main menus at the top that are drop-downs with commands that are context-specific within JupyterLab. Yeah, and so in this main area, you can see this is called the launcher. And generally what that's going to be doing is launching something into the main area. So it could be a file editor like this Jupyter Notebook file editor, but it can also be a code console or a terminal. And these are all core extensions. And then we also have a text file, markdown file, and Python file as built-in launcher tiles. But they're all using the same code editor, and I bring that up because as an extension author, you can use that code editor as well. And then in the side panel, we have a file browser. There's a way of tracking open tabs, kernels, and terminals. A table of contents for notebooks or any file type, and an extension explorer, which shows you your installed extensions and helps you install new extensions. Yeah, so that's kind of what I wanted to show you about just core JupyterLab. And now I'm going to get into the extension examples. So the first extension that I wanted to start with was Draw.io. And you might have seen that. Actually, it's its own thing, but they made a JupyterLab extension. And it's just a simple way of making a diagram. We have, so it opens this main area widget with a file editor and a .dio file. So this is a good example of an extension making a file type accessible to JupyterLab users. And the other thing I wanted to show about this extension is that it's adding a main menu up to the top. So you can add, as an extension author, more options into this main menu that are specific to your extension. Like this is allowing you to change the format of the editor or just do different kinds of edits. The next extension that I wanted to show is LaTeX, and I'm sure everyone's used LaTeX here, but if you haven't, it's just a language that helps you write mathematical and scientific notation. But the interesting thing about this is it's also a file editor, but when you open it, this is actually the built-in code editor for JupyterLab. And I'm gonna open a sample LaTeX file. But what the extension is doing is actually adding a context menu option, which opens the rendered PDF of your LaTeX in the same view. And yeah, again, if you've used LaTeX, you know how useful it is to see the rendered LaTeX side by side. But the other thing that I wanted to show with this extension is actually getting at that there are different kinds of extensions. There are extensions that are called lab extensions, which kind of more so interact with the front end and rely on APIs that already exist for the back end. But this one needed to run the LaTeX to PDF converter on the back end, so they had to add an API to the server using a server extension. So there's lab extensions and server extensions, and this is an example of an extension that uses both. So the lab extension is adding this button into the context menu and opening the PDF. Another example of that is the Git extension. And so they wanted to have this built-in UI for different, either like looking at Git information or committing your current Git changes. But they had to add an API to the back end so that they could actually access this information from the server. So that's a different angle of how you might use a lab extension and a server extension together. The next extension example that I wanted to show is called spell checker for Markdown. And so if you make a Markdown cell in a notebook and you start typing, it will automatically highlight a word that it doesn't recognize, and then it'll add this context menu with different suggestions of similar words, and then you can click on it and it'll automatically update. And I just wanted to show this to show that you can make an extension that doesn't add necessarily this big renderer like the Git or the draw.io extensions, but it is still using commands in a way that's really useful for users. And then finally, I wanted to go over the third type of extension from lab extensions, server extensions, is the theme extensions. And I'm sure everyone's used theme extensions. There's built-in light and dark mode in JupyterLab, but you can customize those colors, the fonts, to your liking. And this is an example of like an alternate dark mode called Darkula that has been popular with JupyterLab users. So yeah, those are the extension examples that I wanted to show. And then one last thing, this is about publishing extensions, so, and also kind of as a user, how you would interact with extensions has changed because, so currently we're on JupyterLab 3, we're about to release JupyterLab 4 this year. But starting with JupyterLab 3, we changed the way that extensions publish their extensions. We called it the earlier version source, and you had to install them using npm, and you had to rebuild JupyterLab every time you installed an extension to be able to use it. And we've shifted to something called pre-built, which you can install using pip, which most people using JupyterLab will install JupyterLab using pip, and you don't have to rebuild when you install the extension. So that's what we're recommending for new extensions to be pre-built, and the difference as an extension author is mostly just in configuration, like code mostly stays the same, but that's just something to keep in mind if you're looking at the different ways to configure your extension. We're gonna build it in a pre-built extension configuration by default. So yeah, that's just a note, and with that, I'm gonna pass it off to Alex to go over how to actually write an extension.
I am shorter, so that needs to go down. Plug this in. No. Everybody hear me? Awesome. So thank you, Martha, for kind of giving us the walkthrough of the different types. So I'm actually going to be walking through, we're calling this anatomy of extension. The idea is I'm actually going to walk you guys through some example code, show you the different pieces and chunks of what makes an extension in code. And the end goal of this is for you guys to get your fingers into like actual writing of code. So after I kind of walk through this, we're actually going to give you guys a 20, 30-minute exercise where you guys are going to take the code that I'm showing you and you're going to edit it and actually try to extend it and do a little bit more. So while I'm talking, if anybody has not already git cloned the Git repo that we had listed on the SciPy website, it's also listed here. Not there. Which one is it? Oh, I didn't actually have it in the docs. It's under Martha's. I can share. Oh, I remember. I shared it on Slack. So anybody who's on the Slack channel for this tutorial, I shared the link to it there. You can find that link. It's under Martha's user, and that has all the slides and examples and stuff that we're using for this today, including the example code that I'm actually going to walk through. So again, this example code is built using the cookie cutter. The cookie cutter is a JupyterLab cookie cutter. Anybody ever used cookie cutter before, the tool cookie cutter? Okay, a few of you. So cookie cutter is pretty cool. You just pip install cookie cutter, and then you just say cookie cutter and you give it like a Git repo, and it clones that Git repo and then creates an instance of the cookie cutter for you. In this case, it gives you the bare minimum, bare bones extension in order to actually start. So you don't have to figure out, oh, what are all my imports? What are all my build files? Like, what's my index? You don't have to deal with all of those nitty gritties. It gives you a starting point. So when we start coding today, we're going to be doing that cookie cutter step. Also, this example I'm going to walk through is loosely based on the example in the JupyterLab docs. So anybody who's actually looked at the JupyterLab docs before, and looked at the example tutorial in there, it's a very, very long, detailed doc. It's very frustrating and difficult to read sometimes because it is so detailed. So we're going to be basing that off of this, off of that. So, oh, Martha pasted that into the example there. So let's dig into the code. So I'm going to come over here to VSCode. I personally don't use VSCode all the time. Zoom in, yep. What's the quick code for that again? Command plus, there we go. There we go. Is that big enough? Or do you guys want it bigger? That look good to everybody? Other people who need glasses like myself? A little bit more? Yeah, I'm going to minimize the file browser here a little bit. There we go. Okay, so if you come look at this file browser, I've already opened up where I cookie cuttered. So you can see all of these codes, all of this. This was auto-populated by the cookie cutter. That's how much the cookie cutter does for you. It's very useful. It gives you all of these build files. It sets up linting. It sets up tests. Piyush recently committed or opened up some code that will also set up being able to test. Yeah. So yeah. So I'm going to walk through. What I'm in right now is the index.ts file. You can write in pure JavaScript, but most people choose to write in TypeScript when creating extensions. Anybody in here never touched JavaScript or TypeScript before? Okay, so we have a couple people who've never touched. JavaScript nowadays is not the JavaScript of the 90s. It is practically a full programming language on its own, not just some script thing you type in your browser anymore. The front end of JupyterLab is written in JavaScript and TypeScript. TypeScript is a typed JavaScript, and when you build it, it just compiles down into pure JavaScript. That code can look really ugly though, so sometimes if you look at the code in your browser, it's not always pretty. So yeah, I'm just going to start walking through the anatomy. So in the index file, this is where you kind of start. An extension consists of lots of different parts. In this case, we start with the plugin. The plugin is what is actually is the bulk of the extension. It's the core. So the idea is you write a plugin in your index file, and at the bottom of the file, you export it as the default. So that's what this says, hey, this plugin is going to initialize and start up my extension. Fun fact, you can have multiple plugins in your index file, and you can export them all. So if you want to create a couple different extensions and just jam pack them all into one like install, you can actually do that. You don't have to have completely separate repos for every single extension. So popping back up to what is this plugin, you give it an ID so you can identify it is. Auto start true because you want JupyterLab to use it. If it's not true, then it won't auto start. And then what's cool about these optionals, these are various registries or other extensions that usually come from core. So your extension can export or return like a registry or some sort of interface that then can be leveraged and used. So if you want to use those interfaces from either core or other extensions, they come here. In this case, we're using the settings registry, which allows you to add more settings to the JupyterLab settings. And we're going to use the launcher, which allows us to add new items to the launcher. And then this is the key, the activate function. Activate is the function that is actually called when JupyterLab starts, and it initializes your extension when it's installed. So the cookie cutter adds this console log. I always like leaving this console log because then when you go into your console on your browser, you can immediately know if it successfully installed your extension or if you have a problem. So yeah, starting off, this is the settings registry. I'm not actually doing anything with the settings registry in this example, but I have it here and all set up in order for you guys to extend it further later if you choose to. In this case, what it's doing is it's going to be taking this schema over here called plugin.json in the schema directory, and it's just adding these settings to JupyterLab. None of these are super important. It's just title, description, type. There's no additional properties. So it's essentially adding nothing. But if you wanted to add new settings or customizable settings, you can add them in this JSON, and then this will actually add them to the settings registry. I'm not going to go into much detail on that. This is more of a explaining what this is. But when we get to the end and you guys are wanting to like extend it and try yourself, this is a useful base tool for you. This is the MIDI. This is the grid of this. So JupyterLab has this concept of commands. So you can create commands. You give the command a name. You give it a function to execute when the command is called. You can give it a label and an icon. And commands can be used in many different ways. You can just straight up add a command to the launcher, in which case it will use the icon and the label, and it will put that icon and label on the launcher, and when you click the launcher button, it runs the command. You can add the command in a dropdown in the menu, like file open. That runs the file open command. Commands can be added anywhere you want. Commands can be run from other commands. So the command registry, which is right here, is one of the core tenets of extensions. So typically when you're writing extensions, you typically start with writing a command, and then you surface that command to the user somewhere in the code. In this case, we're writing a command called tutorial open. We're opening our tutorial widget. So in the execute, we're creating a tutorial widget. We're adding it to a main area widget, which is important because that's what allows you to then plug it into the main area. It gives it all the main area widget functionality like toolbars, open and close signals, all the nitty-gritty stuff that you don't want to have to deal with when you're writing your own extension. Then we give it a label and an icon, and a caption is the like mouse over text. And then we add it to the shell. The shell in this case is not some like terminal shell. This is literally the shell of the web application. So you're adding it into JupyterLab. So when this command is run, it's going to open up a main area widget containing our tutorial widget. And then down here you can see I add this command to the launcher, which then puts it in the launcher. Just so you guys can see how this works, I'm going to quickly just start up JupyterLab. You guys can see that there's now an open tutorial widget here with the icon that I added. And when I click it, it runs the command, which opens up the tutorial widget in a main area widget. So anybody have any questions on that concept of commands so far? No, okay. So we're gonna pop back over to the code. So this is all done in the activate function. Technically, I could have just made a new widget, like completely empty, doesn't really do anything, but that wouldn't have necessarily been any useful to you guys trying to figure out how widgets work. So I created this new tutorial widget, which I put in the widget.ts file. Put it in a completely separate file. Technically, everything that's in here could actually be defined within that activate function, but that would have just been putting all your eggs in one basket. It would have made the code very messy. So in this case, I defined a new tutorial widget, and it extends widget. Widget is just the bare bones, everything you need to know in a widget, like saving state, the node that it is in the DOM in your web browser. So in this case, in the constructor, I'm creating an element, an image element. So I'm just creating a DOM element in HTML that's an image. And then I'm setting the source on that to this picture. I'm using this site called Pixum. It's like lorem ipsum, but they give you pictures. Pretty straightforward. The example in the documentation for JupyterLab is like super long, 2 pages long, on how you can poll NASA to get cool space images. And it's like 100 lines of code just to get an image. I thought lorem ipsum was faster. And then you'd say this.node. So this, in this case, is this parent widget, and node is actually just, we're going to follow through using the browser. It literally is the DOM node owned by the widget. So when you create a widget, it just happens to have an HTML element. If you never add this to the shell, it's just going to be floating in nothing. That's why adding it to the shell in that activate function is so important. So we're just going to close that real quick. And so I'm appending that child, the image. So now I've put this image in the thing. So that's what puts this image into the main area. It's just HTML. You can do a lot of really cool things in there other than that, but I wanted to make it simple. So coming back over here, you'll notice I have this commented out right now. It says this.load image. This is because I hard-coded image source here. We've also wrote this helper function called loadImage, which leverages a server extension, which creates an API that I'm calling. In this case, the API is image. So this would be localhost / I think it's just this /image, if I remember correctly. Might have still been lab /image. I got it wrong. I'll remember that API eventually. But the idea is we've created an API that you can call, and it's a server extension. I'll walk into the server extension in a second. But this is making an API request to that, getting that image, and setting the image source to that new image. So this is a pretty cool function. We're not using it in this place right here. This is actually going to be part of the example that exercise you guys are going to walk through, is leveraging this function, which refreshes the image. Yes, there we go. You'll notice here, I have this little button here called, it looks like a little refresh button in the tab. Can everybody see that? It's up here. And when I click it, it refreshes it. This is going to be your guys' exercise in a few minutes to add this button. It's one of the reasons I didn't rebuild before I started demoing, because this code is not actually in the IDE right now. I built this and ran this yesterday, and so the example's already written and committed. So I'm going to have you guys add this button, which then calls that function. But first, a quick walkthrough of what a server extension looks like. So you'll see in here that we have this source directory, which has all these TypeScript files. Similarly, we have the tutorial extension directory. Tutorial extension is the name of this extension. And in here is all the Python files. So by default, like the init and version, those are all going to be added because you need those Python files in order to create a pre-built extension. But in addition to that, we added handlers. This is a server extension. So JupyterLab uses Jupyter Server. Jupyter Server itself is the back end. It does all the APIs, all the back end work for those that know you can't do everything in your client's browser. In this case, we are adding a new extension point. So we set up the handlers. This is all filled in by the cookie cutter again. But what we did, we changed this route pattern, and we changed this here, image. This is why, because I needed a tutorial extension, then image. And what it is if you call this, so I'm just going to come over here. If I go to localhost / tutorial extension / image, it returns the image URL. So you can see it's just the URL and a JSON return. This is an API that anybody who has access to your JupyterLab instance can access. And so what we did is we wrote a normal get function that just returns a random image from this list. These are just hard-coded specific images from that lorem pixum. So again, this is just a simple example of a server extension. We just added an API to the JupyterLab server. You can do lots of stuff on the server. It's just a server extension. If anybody's ever used Tornado before, that's the Tornado server is the server that Jupyter Server uses. So anything you can use in a Tornado application, you can use in Jupyter Server. Jupyter Server can be run on its own if you want it to, but it is the backend for JupyterLab. Yeah, so that's the server. Again, we just tweaked the cookie cutter a little bit by changing this. This used to be test because it was a cookie cutter. And then we just changed the return to be this image URL.
Quick question.
Yeah.
You said this is a public REST endpoint, basically. Is there a way to interact with the session that belongs to a particular user or notebook?
I believe yes. Luciano, did you pick up his question?
So is there a way to interact with like particular user session or do something that's specific to a user session or their state of the server?
If you mention the session as kind of like just a web session, no, but there is a concept of like sessions in terms of like how it connects with, let's say, the kernel and everything. Those objects are exposed and you can control that. I think if you want to see an example, in Lyra, the Python editor uses a lot of that communication to start a kernel on behalf of the user and things like that. So that is a good place for at least looking to an example of how that is.
For those that couldn't quite hear Luciano and for the recording, quick summary of what he said. If you're talking specifically about kernels, you can access kernel information and kernel sessions through the API. And there are many examples of that online. Luciano pitched our team's example of Lyra AI, which, who has a Python editor which leverages those APIs. Yeah, so popping back over to the index here. So you can see right here, there's a nice to-do. Add a button to refresh the image. So has everybody managed to git clone this repo? So it's called, this is the repo that we've linked. Should look like this. I'll refresh it. Probably have new things pushed. There we go. Has anybody had trouble git cloning this or not git cloned it yet? Okay, so if anybody's having trouble git cloning this, you can have some of us come around and help. But the idea is in this repo, in examples, there is tutorial extension. You will want to open up either the whole Git repo or specifically this folder in your IDE. I've been doing everything in VSCode because that is the open source kind of standard. Most people use it. I personally use PyCharm in my day-to-day, but that's because as an Apache committer, I have access to free PyCharm. Not everybody can afford the PyCharm price. So I would recommend opening up this extension example in your IDE, because we're going to be editing right here where this to-do is. In a second, I will teach you guys how to build, but coming back over to our setup. So this is going to be our code exercise. So as I said, we're going to be opening up that example in your IDE. And the goal is to add a toolbar button that refreshes the image using these are the hints. I gave you guys some hints so you guys know where to start. So the toolbar can be accessed by accessing the toolbar object inside the main area widget. A toolbar button is a class that creates a toolbar button that you can then add to the toolbar, and that class can be found in JupyterLab AppUtils. If you want to know the answer is on the next slide after this, which is available in the README through a link, and you could cheat if you really, really want to. But I suggest you guys take the next 20 to 30 minutes to try to add this button. Just to show you guys again, this is what it does look like when you open it. It has a button on this toolbar. When you click it, it changes the image. Again, all of the code that you would need to do this can go right in here in this to-do. I'll make a note that when you want to import, for instance, the toolbar button, so when I say there's a toolbar button class, you can just add toolbar button right here, like that, and then you can create a new toolbar button. So that's in AppUtils as an example. And so the idea is, here in this to-do, you want to create a toolbar button, and then you want to put that toolbar button into the toolbar using the hints that I'm going to leave on the screen now. So that's going to be our 20 to 30-minute exercise. It is 2:05. I say I will kind of reconvene at 2:30 to see how everybody's doing. I'm going to check our README just a sec. We have our kind of our agenda here in this repo as well, if you ever look at the README. We are going to be following this with like a 10-minute break. So how about we will reconvene at 2:45. So that will be including the break. So you can take your break early if you really want to just blow off the exercise, but why would you be here? But yeah, that is going to be the break. So the four of us will be available to walk around. You just need to raise your hand, and we'll be able to come answer questions. They don't necessarily have to be around this exercise, but adding a button to the toolbar used to be the whole exercise. Like when I did this tutorial 2 years ago, adding a button to the which one? The notebook widget was actually the whole thing. That was the end goal. But most people don't need to add a button to a notebook anymore. They want something more, which is why we're making this bigger. So yeah, you guys have time. Just feel free to raise your hands if you have questions. Does anybody feel uncomfortable not wearing a microphone walk around, or do you guys want me to put my mask on? Okay, cool.
Okay, so I just wrote stuff. JupyterLab up and running. I have the repo client. What I would like to do actually before I hire terrible code, is I'd like to go ahead and do the extension.
I meant to tell everybody that. Already got caught. I forgot to teach you guys how to build the extension so you can even run it. This is actually all in the README. So if you did the cookie cutter in the tutorial, all the steps are in the README. But I'm just going to open up this README real quick and show you guys it. So here in it, here is the README file. And what's really cool about the VS Code is you can do this, and it opens up the Markdown. So when you publish it, you would just do this pip install. But we're doing dev, so you actually need to do these steps down here in this code block. So you'd want to do a pip install -e dot. So that's going to install all of your dependencies, which includes JupyterLab server, all the JupyterLab build utils. If I remember correctly, you probably will actually have to pip install JupyterLab itself before you do any of this. I don't know when it happened, but the last time I checked out the cookie cutter, it did not install JupyterLab anymore. It used to install JupyterLab with the cookie cutter, but it doesn't. So yeah, I want to pip install JupyterLab. Then inside of this directory, you pip install -e dot. This actually installs your dependencies. Then you do JupyterLab extension develop dot. This will actually symlink your directory that you're currently in, the build files, into JupyterLab. This is one of the keys with pre-built extensions that you're developing, because normally pre-built extensions just put all the built files into a JupyterLab directory and say, it's there. Well, when you're building, those pre-built files don't exist. So what we do is we symlink our build directory into there. That's what this JupyterLab extension develop command does. And then the third step is Jupyter server extension enable. This simply says, oh, there is a server extension, turn it on. The server extension was already installed in the first two steps. And then the very last step is JLPM build. JLPM is just JupyterLab's like wrapper around Yarn, if anybody's used Yarn or NPM before. What this is going to do is this is going to actually build out the files into that build directory that we've already symlinked. So if you do these 4 steps, that will install your extension, and then you can just run JupyterLab. Yeah, and then if you ever need to rebuild, you can just run this again, and it will immediately update in JupyterLab with just a refresh of your browser. So we did mention in the prereqs for this course that we do suggest doing all of this in a Conda environment. For those that have used Conda or a Python environment, if you try to do a lot of these steps in what we would refer to as a dirty environment, you can run into a lot of build and install issues with like conflicting versions, conflicting dependencies, and weird stuff. So if you know anything about Python environments, I would suggest creating a fresh, new, clean environment. If you do not, you don't have to worry. We can always help you, or you can try to do it without the Python environment, and we can debug with you if it ever causes problems. Okay, now you guys are ready to go. Given I took another 5 minutes of you, we'll go till 10 till now.
Hey everyone, my name is Piyush Jain. I work in AWS, and I make open source contributions to JupyterLab. I'm gonna go over how you would debug JupyterLab extensions. So this is the agenda that we'll go over. I'm gonna talk about a few use cases when debugging is useful, and then we'll actually walk through how to set up debugging for JupyterLab within VSCode. I specifically picked VSCode because a lot of the front-end coders are actually using VSCode for their front-end development. And VSCode has a really rich interface to actually debug both the front-end and the back-end code. After setting up, we'll actually walk through how do you launch JupyterLab, how do you launch a debugging session for JupyterLab within a VS Code. So I'll show that. And then how you would set different breakpoints. I'll show how do you do that both in the front-end extension as well as the server extension. And if you are not using VS Code and you want to do debugging in the command line, I'll show some other ways to set up that, so that you can, if somebody's not using VS Code, you can do that from the command line as well. And it's a very hands-on part of the tutorial. So I'll actually walk through how to set up. So there's another cookie cutter as a part of this repository. And we'll be using that to set up debugging. So when is debugging really useful, right? So debugging might be useful if you have actual errors in the code and you might want to go through the code and see what's happening actually inside the code. So a common issue that you might see when you're working with extensions is that the UI that you're trying to create is missing, or you have the content which you did not expect to see. And so to investigate those issues, having a debugging setup within the code is very useful. It's also very useful if you want to see how Core JupyterLab extensions work. Like if you are trying to see how the toolbar is used within JupyterLab, you can actually debug the code for the JupyterLab code repository and see how it's set up, how the code path is working. It's also very useful if you are just trying to set up a new extension that you're working with and don't know how the extension is working. You can actually go into the debugging session and look at and inspect different objects and variables to see what's going on. Yeah, so these these are the common scenarios when something goes wrong in a JupyterLab extension. Most common of them is you'll see that the UI elements are missing. So that means that either there's something that failed on the server side to load, which UI depended on, or there was an actual JavaScript error, so that UI actually failed to load. So there are 2 places that you can actually look for these errors. The first thing you can do is look at the actual Jupyter server log, and I'll show that when I set up the debugging session, and I'll go through that. So Jupyter server log is the log. When you launch JupyterLab in the console, there is a log that prints out all the server-side failures on that log, and you can actually look through that log to see if there is any server-side problems. Another thing that you can do is you can actually look for any JavaScript errors inside the browser console. So these are usually linked with any JavaScript errors in the code or any UI-related problems in your extension. So browser console is really helpful for that. So the next part of the presentation is going to be focused on actually setting up the debugging within the code that you just worked on within VSCode. And there's another file that is there in the repo that you see. It should be in examples debugging.md. And if you open that, it has step-by-step instructions on how to set up the debugging session within the VSCode. So you don't have to change any directories. The place that you were working with before for Alex's part, you can start from there, and you can work through those instructions to set this up. But I'm actually going to walk through that here and show you how to do that. So let me share that. So I already have the extension and the exercise part of the code setup here. So let me just show you that works. Yeah, so it already has this tutorial widget, and it has this refresh button also that refreshes the image. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to go back to the terminal and stop the server. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to actually, so there's another cookie cutter that is part of this repository, which actually sets up all the configuration for the debugging session. So I'm going to say, let me just make sure I have cookie cutter installed. So if you don't have cookie cutter, just make sure that you have cookie cutter installed. So I already have that installed here. And the next thing I'm going to run is cookie cutter. Let me just make it bigger. And debug config cookie cutter. So this directory should be in the parent directory of where you are running the tutorial extension. So once I run that, it's going to give me some prompts, and you can basically just select all the defaults. You can just click enter on all of these and run through. So I'm just going to do that. Okay. So what this does is it adds some configuration within your VS Code and your tutorial extension directory, and I'll go through that. So you see this new directory called .vscode. VS Code uses this to set up all the settings, launch configurations which are used for running and debugging. So that's what you see here. And if I open launch file here, you'll see that there are two targets here, two configurations. The first one here actually launches Jupyter Server or JupyterLab, but it doesn't open the browser on its own. The second one is what opens the browser, and it'll basically attach a session with the VS Code so that you can debug interactively within VS Code. Okay. It also adds this webpack config file, which is needed because this extension is written in TypeScript, and if you build it without adding source map, so source map is a way of adding references to TypeScript files, the source files, because when this extension compiles and runs in the browser, it's running as JavaScript files, and the browser doesn't know how to go back to the TypeScript source file. So that's what the source maps do, and some of this configuration basically enables that. And so once you run the cookie cutter, you can come back to this run and debug menu. This on the left here, I'm going to click that, and you'll see that it has this target called JLab debug. And if I click on this right now, it's actually going to run the JupyterLab, and it's going to launch a new JupyterLab session here. And so this should refresh in a minute once the server starts. So there's sometimes the session that VS Code starts, it fails to refresh the JupyterLab session. So what you can do is, so what happened here, you can just click on refresh, and then that should load JupyterLab. It happens occasionally. I've seen it happening. I'm not sure why. So we have the same extension. I can open that. It loads an image. I can refresh it from here. But what this provides is it also gives you this debugger interface. So you have all these commands here. So this is used to step into or step over code. And then you have all the call stack here. You can add new variables into the watch list to see the state of different variables and objects. You can do that from here. And I'll show you, actually, I'll add a breakpoint inside the extension and show you how that is working. Let me do that. So I'm going to go to index.ts here, and I'm going to put a breakpoint here. So I'm just going to click on this line here, and it's going to put this breakpoint here. And now if I go back to this session and refresh, the controls should go back to my VS Code editor now in a second. Oh, actually, I failed to do one thing. So remember how I was telling you that in order for the browser to know where the source files are, it needs the source maps. So after we added the cookie cutter, we didn't build the project again. So we need to build it so that the source maps are referenced correctly. So I'm gonna stop this and go back to the command line, and I'm gonna build again. I'm gonna say glpm build. Okay. So there's another missing step here. I need to run glpm install because this cookie cutter adds some new dependencies. So we need to run that first. Okay. So once that's done, I'm gonna build. So all these instructions should be in the debugging tutorial file that I was talking about. So once this step finishes, it should correctly link the source maps into the generated source code. So now if I launch from here again, so I'm still in the run and debug menu here, and I'm gonna click on this. And let's see if it refreshes this time. Oh, it did refresh it, okay. Okay, so now you see how it came back inside VS Code automatically because I had a breakpoint. And you can see I can inspect any object here. So for example, I'm looking at app. I can actually look at all the commands that are there. So I can say app.commands here. And I can look at all the commands that are registered here. And so this is useful. This breakpoint that I have, this is part of the front-end extension. So this is for all the UI code, the JavaScript code that you have, or TypeScript code. So it can help with that. Similarly, we can also add a breakpoint on the server extension side. So let me just do that. So let me go back to here. And let's go in the handlers file. And I'm going to put a breakpoint here. And I actually don't need to reload this because once I hit this and click on refresh, it should go back here. So this is gone back to the Python handler. So this is the actual API that returns the image URL. So you can inspect things here as well. So you can see that this is the image URL it's going to return. And so this is useful for actually looking at the Python code that works on the server extension side. I'm going to let it go. So at this point, if you have been following through and you have the cookie cutter setup done, you should be ready to debug both the front end and server side extension in your VS Code instance. I can show some examples of common errors that can happen and how to go about debugging them because some of these errors are not obvious. So I'm going to go through that a little bit. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop this session. And so stopping, so you have to click this twice because it has two targets. One is actually launches the Jupyter server and the other one's actually launch the Chrome browser. So I'm going to just stop both of them here. And I'm going to just say remove this part here, this import statement. And so what would happen is that this API will fail to load when I refresh the image from the front-end extension. And we'll see an error on the UI side because there will not be any image to load on that end. And we'll also see an error in the server log here. So I'll just show that. Let me do that. So I'm going to run it again here. Let me remove the breakpoint. Okay. All right. So this loaded fine because this is on the UI side, but if I try to refresh this part, you can see that it's not actually changing the image. And if we go back here, this was the server log I was referring to earlier. So this is this will have all the errors from the server side extension, and you can see that it's talking about that this this module is missing because we never imported that. So it's basically throwing that exception. So you can, the first thing you can do when you see that something is not working on the server extension is you can come to the server log and see if there are any errors. So I'm going to put that back. Let me go back here, handlers.py, and I'm going to say import random. Okay. There are some other types of errors that can happen that doesn't actually throw a lot of errors on the server log because the extension, the server extension itself fails to load, and those happens. I have seen that happening when you are refactoring code and you failed either to do the right import or the import that doesn't exist. So for example, if I try to do something like import test, this module doesn't exist. So what this will do is basically it'll fail this whole file to load, and so the extension, the server-side extension will never load. So if I actually start the Jupyter session now, and I actually want you to look at here. So it's saying here, this line, extension failed loading with message runtime, right? So these types of error are hard to see because once you start working with JupyterLab after you know, you have actually loaded, basically you're at the bottom of the log here, and so you usually don't know that this extension didn't load. And so there's a better way to see if you have actually a coding error in server extension, and I'll show that how to do that. But I want to just show here that if we start to refresh, oh, how is that working? I'm not sure how this should be working, but it should be failing this module. But let me show you how to see, how to actually see these errors. So what you can do is you can just say Jupyter server extension list. And if you have an error on any of these extensions, like for example, the tutorial extension, it will actually show you the stack trace for that extension, whatever the error is. Because of the extension is not loaded, it's not going to actually throw the error in the server log when you're actually working with the extension. So it's useful in this case when the actual extension is not loaded. So there are some other ways to debug JupyterLab extensions. If you're not working with VSCode, and if you want to work in the command line, you can, so for front-end extensions, you can directly debug within the browser. So for example, I can actually go here, and if I just start my JupyterLab session from here, and I'm going to go into Sources tab and look at page. And all the tutorial extension code should be here. Now this will only work, and it will correctly link the TypeScript files if you have the correctly generated source maps. Otherwise, it will show JavaScript files, which might be minimized sometimes, and so you're not able to actually look at the code. But since this has the correct source maps, you can actually link the TypeScript files. So I can, for example, go here, and I can put a breakpoint here itself. If I reload that, it stops there. So this is another way to do that if you don't want to do it from VS Code. I'm going to stop that and run it. So this is for the front-end extensions. If you want to debug something for a Python extension, there are two choices. One is using the Python command line debugger. So you can add this statement, import PDB, and then PDB set trace in the code where you want to put the breakpoint, and it'll actually stop at that line. But a better option is to use the IPython debugger. So this has a more interactive, and it has colored output. So you can use IPython debugger as well. It has the same interface as PDB. The only difference is you will use basically, you will import IPDB and set trace on that. I can actually show this for the Python debugger, how this looks like. And so I'm going to go here in my Python code, and I'm going to put a breakpoint here. So I'm going to say import PDB, pdb.setTrace, and now if I run JupyterLab, close that. Right, and I'm going to open that, and I'm going to try to refresh. So now you can see that it actually stopped the debugger here. So I can list my code here. So it shows me that this is the next line that's going to, I can print out different variables. It's showing me that this is the image URL it's going to send back. So this is useful if you have a code that's not part of your server extension and something that you cannot access within VS Code. You can do this. So I'm going to get out of this and close my extension. Let's try it with IPDB. So IPDB, you have to install that. So I'm going to install that. And very similar to PDB, I'm just going to add IPDB and IPDB.setTrace. Okay, and I'm going to run JupyterLab once again. Okay, open that and refresh. Okay, so this is a little bit better because you have colored output. You can look at more code. It has the same interface as PDB, but it is just a little nicer than the default Python debugger. I can look at image URL. Close that. Did anyone so far set up the debugging part, and were they successful? I see only one nod, two.
How do you make the command shot in VS Code, the JLab debug?
So if you if you use the cookie cutter, it should already add the configuration, and once that is added, then you will see, once you click on this run and debug on the left, you will have a JLag debug target there if you have the launch configuration added to VSCode. And I can look through that if anything is missing. Anybody else had any success with this? I can walk you through if you are having any trouble setting this up.
I think in Python 3.7 or later, you can use the breakpoint built in rather than using TDD set traces, right? Going back to one of your other slides.
I never had success with that. I don't know if there is anything needed to set that. I'm not sure, but that's true.
That's more than I've done, so good.
Yeah. No, I know it. I have seen people using it, but when I tried it, I have Python 3.8 here. It doesn't stop there. So maybe there's a flag needed to on it. So I think at this point I can help you set up debugging if you want, or if anybody was not successful doing the previous exercise, I can help with that. But this is the end of the debugging part of the tutorial. And if you want to work on any of the extensions, we can help with that also. Is there anything else you want to add, Alex or Martha?
Yeah, I did want to. So, you guys can keep working on the adding the button and leveraging the debugging, but we also want to give you the opportunity to just start from scratch and write your own cookie cutter extension. So if anybody's interested in just not starting from our little example, but starting from scratch, I can walk through the steps to use the cookie cutter. But there should be a link in the slides, I think earlier in the slides, to the actual cookie cutter.
Mm-hmm.
It's in one of my slides, not that one. Yeah, right there. So that first link there, if you go to that, that's the cookie cutter we use. It actually has instructions in its own README on how to use it. And you just follow those instructions, and it will create a cookie cutter extension that you can then start filling in. The example extension is just an edited version of that, but we've added a lot of extra dependency imports and settings and stuff. So if you did the two, there's actually lots of little tinkering that I did to make it simple for you guys to run without having to worry about those little nitty-gritty things. So yeah, if you came here with an idea for an extension and want to start with that cookie cutter and start tinkering with yourself, we are available. If you just want to try to keep adding that button just so you get a feel of it, that's also good too.
Yeah, I'm going to leave this open, so if you want to
Yeah, that's a
refer that.
slide to lead over.
Yeah.
And again, for the example, if you really want to, you can go to that doc. It is overly detailed and way more precise than the example I did, but it is where I got the inspiration of the idea of putting an image in an extension, in a widget, and making that, and putting that in the main area. It also has way more details about server extensions. If you remember my server extension detail, it was like, this is an API, done. They actually go into like doing in-depth API calls to other services and embedding that into the server and making a more detailed server extension. And a server extension is where Piyush's debugging really comes in handy.
Yeah.
As he said, debugging on the front end is really simple. You just go into your browser.
Yeah.
Debugging on the back end
Is very much more, yeah.
is not. Thus the reason for 6 slides.
And JupyterLab has an examples repository, and I will link that later on on the repository that has a bunch of examples how to do different things in JupyterLab. For example, if you want to add something to the menu, how you do that. If you want to remember the state when you refresh something, that's also there. So there are lots of examples that you can follow in learning how to do different things in JupyterLab. So I'll add that later onto the slide as well.
That's the repo I use to learn how to put a button in the toolbar. So it's a very useful repo.
Yeah, definitely. All right.
We should probably also bring up there's a list of extension ideas also in the slideshow. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
it's like the last slide that JupyterLab compiled. So if you're also looking for ideas for the end and you want to work on an extension but you don't have an idea, there are ideas in that list that's linked.
So these are all the extension ideas that people have suggested. So if there's anything here that jumps out at you, you want to try, you can try these too.
And these are specifically open issues against Jupyter, where after somebody opened this issue, it's like, oh, I want to add this. The developers said, that's a great idea. That's a good third-party extension. And so they throw the extension tag on it, and that's what we're filtering on in that hole. The slides are very useful. We have lots of links in the slides. You can find them. You can find a PDF of them inside the repo we had you clone, or in the README. There's a link to a Google Doc that you can just link to, which is how we're displaying it.
I think just adding to what Alex is saying, I think during the first period, we saw a couple of enhancements or bug fixes that could be done. Those are also like good examples of like PRs that could be created by you guys, like the JupyterLab /watch instead of just JupyterLab. Those are small, but we have a lot of other users that go through the same steps. So feel free to create PRs for them.
Yeah, you can open PRs on this repo. You can open PRs on the cookie cutter itself. You can open issues with notes. The Slack channel for this is also available for posting. I've been trying to keep up on it while we've been in here, but yeah. So yeah, we have what? Is it just shy of an hour and a half of free time?
Yep.
So how about we say 1 hour from now, so 4:30, we'll come back together. We can do some like Q&A and show and tell if anybody like created something. Say, hey, look at this cool thing I just did this past hour. Want to share it? Or I could just walk through how I did the button if everybody's still stuck. So, does that sound good to everybody? You guys an hour of us just being here to help you? Cool. There are now
All right.
5 of us because Jason got here. Okay, so as you can see here, this is all the code I added. It is a full 2 lines, except one of them got lint wrapped. So as I said, I created a toolbar button. Toolbar button can take props. Those 2 props that I leveraged was the icon and the on click. I set the icon to be the refresh icon, which I, if you come up here, just imported from UI components. Similarly, I imported toolbar from app utils like I showed earlier. Coming back down here, the on click, you pass it a function. So I said the function is, you can define a function like this in TypeScript, and I just called on the widget the load image. So when you click it, it runs widget load image. And then I went into the main area widget, toolbar, add item, which is a function on the toolbar class. I named it refresh, and I gave it the button. In this case, button had to be a toolbar button. And that was how I added the button in 2 lines.
What is defined as the widget.load image?
So widget.loadImage was that function in the tutorial widget called loadImage, which calls the API. That was the important part about having this function, was so we could call it on that on click. If it wasn't in its own function, it wouldn't have been able to be called like that. So yeah, that was how I defined it in 2 lines. So yeah, now that I showed you guys that, did anybody start working on anything else? Like had any other ideas that they wanted to share or even demo? Or if you guys want to just keep working, we will be here till 5 because that's when we said we'd be here, unless everybody leaves this room. No, not a wink wink. I am very much available until 5 to answer questions. I know that when you're getting started on working on extensions, there are lots of pitfalls that you can fall down and spiral for hours to days. A good example is we mentioned the idea of pre-built versus source extensions early on in this. I work on a project called Elira. Elira is a suite of extensions, which is it's its own ball of yarn because unlike a normal extension where you just have the one extension and everything's streamlined, suite of extensions is you have multiple extensions, each defined all in one repository, and you have to deal with the extra step of doing that install step for multiple of them. So when we decided to update to using the new pre-built system of build, I had to completely change all of our build tools. I thought it would take me a week or 2. It took me 2 months. And that was like all I worked on for 2 months. That is a great example of like knowing exactly what you need to do, having all the documentation there, and yet stepping in pitfalls. Not knowing, oh, I'm stuck here, I should go ask this question to this person. Because like, I can see Jason like nodding in the background because like, there was probably quite a few places there if I just like pinged Jason or pinged one of the other committers, they're like, oh yeah, no, you just do this. But I didn't necessarily take that step to ask that question or know who to ping and when to ping them. So it's very easy to step into those pitfalls. That was 2 years after I started working on JupyterLab, I hit that. So this was literally February that I finally figured that out. So yeah, easy to hit those pitfalls. We are always available to answer questions. JupyterLab itself actually has a Gitter for the JupyterLab repo, for those that know how to use Gitter, where you can ask questions. People always are following that. And for those that are interested, JupyterLab also has dev calls every Wednesday. The links and info on that is available on the JupyterLab repo. That's a great place to get questions answered, both for developing JupyterLab itself, but also developing your own extensions. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, I wrote an extension that allowed you to put a Streamlit app inside of JupyterLab. And after I finished that, I did a 5-minute demo at our dev call saying, hey, check out this extension I wrote. And everybody's like, oh, yeah, cool. And some people are like, oh, I have a question about that. And people are like, oh, how'd you do that? I was like, iframes. And then like 3 people like, oh, how the heck do you use iframes in JupyterLab extensions? And so like you get those answers when you go to those dev calls. Central time, the dev call's at 11 a.m. You can convert that to whatever time you are locally. So yeah, did anybody work on anything else they wanted to share, ideas, or just take the next 45 minutes to just keep hanging out? examples repo, it literally says how to make a button, and that's all it does. The button doesn't even do anything. It just shows you how to make a button. Shows you how to make a theme. The theme doesn't do anything, but it shows you like how to define it. And they're very concise, and they're all separate and individual. That's a great example. And there's, of course, this tutorial. If you just Google tutorials, you can even find some of our old tutorials. The reason I didn't just use my code from my old tutorial is because it was before pre-built extensions existed, and I didn't want to shackle everybody with the use of a source extension, because one of our more long-term goals is to stop using source extensions because they're a pain. They have extra build steps because you don't want your client to have to build after they install. Like, the idea of saying, oh, pip install Jupyter, then JupyterLab build, then run Jupyter, like, nobody wants to do that. So, yeah. Any other ideas people want to share, or places they got stuck? Or you can just keep chugging along here.
So this isn't really either of those. So looking through the extension examples, so it seems like that very nicely lays out individual pieces of what you can do. Suppose we wanted the launcher icon and the main menu item and the context menu.
Yeah.
You put all those into one extension, you create extensions, what?
That's the cool thing. Whichever you want.
Okay.
So a good example is, so in Elira we have something called the Python editor. We literally took the file editor and we said, okay, when it's a Python file, also wrap, like essentially wrap that file editor and add more stuff to it. So we added a separate launcher item. We added a new thing to the file new. So if you say file new, there's also one there. All of this was done in the one activate function. We also wanted a theme. Well, we wanted that theme in a bunch of different places, so we put the theme in a completely separate extension. Now, inside of core, there's some great examples of, oh, well, I want a button, and I want it that does something, but I also want this main area widget that does something. And so they created two separate plugins that each have their own activate function, but they're both in the same index file, and it just exports both of them. So you can put it all in one activate, it's all one extension, or you could put multiple plugins, but they're still all in one extension. Or you can make completely separate extensions, and you can do all of them. All of these are valid ways of doing it. One of the coolest things about how JupyterLab was written is how modular it is. You can make one giant monolith, or you can make 30 different one-liners. And how modular you want to get is entirely up to you.
Code organization is really what you want to do with it. The question is, do you want to put all of it in one or in a separate? If you think that somebody might use that one button in some other way, then you might want to put it in a separate extension. So I would think that that might be.
One of the advantages of having separate plugins that are in one extension is you can install that full extension, but then if somebody else comes along, you can actually disable plugins. So if somebody else comes along, they're like, oh, I installed this extension, but I don't want this plugin from the extension, they can disable that, which allows it to not, so it's monolithic to use, so you don't have to install multiple extensions, and you've got all these things, but somebody can, it's modular enough that somebody else can come in and disable bits of it. That's a good example of why you might have multiple plugins in one extension. Yeah, and that's also something that I think we put in the slides, but we might not have very detailed discussed the difference between a widget, a plugin, and an extension. So a plugin is those individual things that each have the activate function. Yeah.
You're giving great information. If you can speak into the mic, we'll be
Yeah, that's fair. I just speak loud all the time.
But people on the recording can't hear you.
Oh, that's right. There's a recording. Yeah, that helps. So yeah, what I was saying was distinguishing between a widget, a plugin, and an extension. So when you're talking about an extension, you're talking about like a specifically like a library, so you can install it. So in our case, the extension is the whole thing that we made from the cookie cutter. You can do pip install extension, and that installs it. Extensions can be as big or as small as you want. The plugin is specifically that JupyterLab plugin that we defined in the index file that had its own activate function. You can have as many as you want in there, or just one, and you just export them, and they can all be in one extension. Widgets, in particular, are just a class. So you can have a widget class, and it can be extended in lots of different ways. You can have a main area widget, you can have a button widget, you can have a sidebar widget, you can not even have a widget, and you can just make a command. And commands don't necessarily have to create widgets. They can just do an action on widgets that already exist. Widgets are very versatile. If you looked at the imports in the code, you'll notice that widget is actually not from JupyterLab. It's from a different library called Lumino. Lumino is part of the JupyterLab org. It's specifically all the UI bits that create JupyterLab. So like the main area, the sidebar, all of those things are defined in Lumino. JupyterLab leverages Lumino as its, what would be the best term? Renderer, maybe, would be the best term. How would you describe Lumino as like JupyterLab uses it? It would be a...
UI components?
Yeah.
The underlying building blocks of building an application like JupyterLab.
Yeah, it's the UI building blocks for JupyterLab.
That's the underlying infrastructure, like signals.
Yeah, signals are a great example. We didn't even talk about signals today. If you have two completely unrelated widgets that need to talk to each other, sometimes, if they're both installed, signals is a great way of doing it. When you can create a signal, and when you do something, you can say signal.emit. And that signal can just be part of your class. And then some other application can come in and depend on you and say, okay, grab that signal object. When this signal, and then I'm going to connect to it and say, when this signal emits, do this. And so, for instance, if I made, let's say we're using the button that we have now, but rather than tying in that like load image, what if we wanted to have that load image called whenever somebody like right-clicked on the right toolbar? You could have a signal set up that's whenever somebody right-clicks on that right toolbar, it emits. And then you can connect that function, that reload function, to that signal, and it will trigger. So signals are very complicated, but also very useful way of having two completely unrelated widgets communicate together. Yeah, and there's lots of signals that get emitted by core JupyterLab. Like you edit a notebook, signals are just popping out saying, oh, I edited this, or this got changed. Spell check, like there was the spell check widget that Martha showed. That I haven't even looked at the code. I can almost guarantee it's using a signal to know that something changed. Check it. So, just mind dumping for you guys. Yeah.
I wasn't here the first part. I was just curious. Have you talked about the plugin playground? And have you talked about JupyterLab?
No, we didn't. Do you want to come up and give a?
Do you want me to? Yeah.
You can just talk about them.
Or even better is demo, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, good. My toolbar's working again. I can actually get out of this.
If it works.
Yeah. Here, have a web browser tab.
Okay, thanks. I'll just show two things that might be interesting to people. First thing is JupyterLite. So we've talked a lot about, you guys have talked a lot about JupyterLab and how JupyterLab extensions are distributed and everything. An even easier way to distribute a JupyterLab extension and JupyterLab itself is JupyterLite. So you'll probably hear a lot about this. There's a lot of hype not like not unfounded hype, but there's a lot of excitement around JupyterLite these days. And for example, you'll see if you go to the NumPy homepage, the NumPy documentation, you'll see in the NumPy documentation, let's see, where is it? Let's see, yeah, here we are. Nope. Where is it? Okay, how about let's go to the ipywidgets documentation. I'm not sure exactly where it is in the NumPy documentation. In the ipywidgets documentation, we just added this like 5 minutes ago. If you go to the latest documentation, you'll notice that you can try ipywidgets directly in your web browser. And it's even better than trying it directly in your web browser. It takes a few seconds to download a few megabytes. So you can see I can try it. And it takes a few more seconds to download a few more megabytes. But basically what's going to happen is it's going to download the entire Python, ipywidgets Python plus a couple other packages, and run them in your browser. And so this doesn't require you to start up JupyterLab, doesn't require you to start up any server, but what it gives you is full working Jupyter Notebook totally in your web browser with the server also running your web browser. It gets better than this. This is kind of a little embedded image. If you just click on one of these links, you have a full JupyterLab running in your web browser where the server is also running in your web browser. And so in that sense, what you can do is you can install your extension. In fact, we installed the JupyterLab GitHub extension right here. You can install it into this JupyterLab that people can go to and access just by going to a web page. No installation, no like anything. Just go to, use your browser, go to this web page, and you have a full running Jupyter server with Python, Matplotlib, NumPy, SciPy, Pandas, on and on and on. So this is sort of a really exciting way to have people access your JupyterLab instance, your JupyterLab, your Python libraries, plus your JupyterLab extensions all together. Just go to this web page. Okay, quick questions about this. It's appearing on people's documentation, like somewhere in the NumPy documentation. I'm not sure exactly which page. There's just like an ipywidgets. Try NumPy right now in your browser. ipyleaflet has it as well. You go to the ipyleaflet documentation, and hey, you can just try it right here in your web browser. Okay, questions about JupyterLite. This is built on the Piyush project, which is providing Python in the browser, which itself came out of the Iodide project from Mike Dropum at Mozilla. And it's a really exciting development in Python and Python in the web browser. You'll probably hear a lot about PyScript at the conference. PyScript is also built on Piyush, and both of these, again, provide Python plus a number of scientific libraries running directly in your web browser. No server connection needed. Just, I keep emphasizing it because I still am in amazement that you can just go to a web page and all your Python scientific stack just works, and JupyterLab just works, and everything just works just like you would expect. Okay. Okay. The other one I'll point out to you that might be interesting to you is...
This is something we thought about leveraging for this.
Yes.
But we decided not to because the three of us had very minimal prior use of this. So we felt it was better as instructors to not teach you guys using a tool that we
Absolutely. Yeah. So
didn't have in-depth understanding of.
if you would like to play around with it, you could install the JupyterLab plugin Playground extension. Essentially what this does is it provides a way to write an extension, just the core body of the extension, just for example, this plugin thing, inside a code editor, inside JupyterLab, and then immediately have JupyterLab run that as an extension. So you can do at least the core of an extension building experience for simple extensions. write in JupyterLab. You paste this code into your editor, you ask JupyterLab to run it as an extension, and your button appears up on your toolbar menu, or your command appears in the commands menu, etc. And so it provides a very quick way to quickly iterate on an extension, or to provide just sort of like a little macro short snippet extension that you can have JupyterLab just pull up every time. So you can add your favorite button to the toolbar without having to create a whole Python package and distribute it on PyPI and then install it in your environment and everything. If you just want some lightweight way to add a button to your toolbar, or to add a new command, or to script, go 3 cells down, insert this text, go 2 cells back up, you know, put a header or whatever, like whatever sort of thing that you want to script, this provides a very simple way to write it and execute it right inside of JupyterLab, or save it in your settings so that it automatically comes up every time you launch JupyterLab. So a very lightweight way to add simple automation in JupyterLab interface from within JupyterLab itself. So there's an example here of the JupyterLab plugin playground. I don't think we have it installed, so I can't demo it. But yeah, too bad we don't have Jupyter Lite for JupyterLab plugin playground. Maybe I'll go do that. So you can click and it'll pop up. Piyush?
So for JupyterLite, I had a question. How would you install your own extension within the JupyterLite environment? Like if I was developing something and I want to be installed as a part, do I have to distribute it with JupyterLite? How would I?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I am just getting familiar with JupyterLite. So I'm going to give you an answer that's to the best of my understanding, and I hope that there's a better answer. So if we launch JupyterLite here, let's just launch the default JupyterLite with default sort of packages configured. Wait, what happened? Oh, you got back. Try it in your browser. JupyterLab. Oops. Where are we?
Right under the JupyterLite text, try Lite now.
No, it's below.
Right here.
It says try it with JupyterLab.
Yeah, there's a bunch of confusing buttons to press. Okay, so you can install a Python package. Let's see, this is using the Pyodide kernel, which we see over in the corner here. You can install a Python package doing import piplite, which is a special version of pip that works in with the browser operating system. And wait, piplite.install, I don't know, ipywidgets or whatever. This just installs the Python package though. So I could import it, but it doesn't install the JupyterLab extension. My understanding is, in order to install the JupyterLab extension, you actually have to configure JupyterLite to be built with that particular extension installed, and we can check that here. The JupyterLab extension is not installed. Oh. It's installed by default here, but if I did a different, yeah, so it's already installed on this particular JupyterLite. But you have to, there's a config file that you essentially, we could try, I just put in a PR to piplite.install. I just put in a PR to install this. GitHub is the one I'm looking for. Yeah, this adds a little GitHub browser. Might be an underscore. Oh, right. Yeah, so it's having some issues. Yeah, so my understanding is you have to configure JupyterLite in order to install the JupyterLab extension, though you can install the Python packages, most Python packages. Yeah, pure Python packages that don't have dependencies that that are not pure Python, which is I think what you're seeing here. Trying to go back. And yeah, anyway, we can find where you configure it. You basically in the JupyterLite config, you just say, okay, here's my federated extensions, and you just give it a list of all the Python packages that contain federated extensions, and then it pulls out of that the JavaScript and bundles it in JupyterLite.
Yeah, it would be cool if you could put
Yeah.
into and see if that works.
Yeah, I mean, we can try it right now if you want. But I think it won't work. In fact, I was just thinking a few minutes ago, wow, would it be easy to enable that? I don't know. Now I have a new question for the JupyterLite folks. Anyway, two things. JupyterLite, which is getting a lot of excitement these days for distributing JupyterLab plus a bunch of plugins, both Python and JavaScript. And the plugin playground, which you might find very useful for doing very lightweight extensions to JupyterLab. Should we try importing it? Is this the Python package? Something happened, right? But the question is, did the JavaScript actually get loaded in JupyterLab?
I think if I understand correctly, it got loaded into that kernel, not JupyterLab itself.
Yeah, so we'll be able to easily see by right-clicking. Yep, there's no menu entry for Jupyter. It's a Jupyter plugin playground. Yep.
No, it makes me wonder if you would run that in the terminal. If it worked.
I don't think there's a terminal in JupyterLite. Yeah,
Then no.
because it's not running a full Linux in your browser. It's just
But
running
when you-
JupyterLab
but it wouldn't-
plus Python.
I would assume that if you included it in the configs,
That's right. Then it should work.
It would most likely work.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, it should work then. That's right.
Which would be fun. You could just spin up a JupyterLite with the playground and just give people a place to play.
Yeah, and that's the way to do that. And
So.
configuring.
But what I found really interesting listening to this though is all of this enables how I originally did this demo. When I go back 2.5 years, like before this was even a tutorial, and I was literally just like walking through in like a half-hour talk. I think this was before you guys were even part of the Elira team. I did this whole extension develop add a button within JupyterLab. I literally spun up JupyterLab, and in JupyterLab created the file, said add the button, and then opened up a terminal in JupyterLab, said install this file. And then I opened up the little sidebar where it lists all the extensions, and I said install extension, and it was all within JupyterLab, no restarts. So a lot of this is enabling that functionality in a more broad sense, and especially with pre-built, because now that we use pre-built, those steps wouldn't work anymore. So this is all really cool stuff. So anybody have any other questions or discussion points they want to talk about? Yeah. We have 15 minutes of time for everybody.
And a word you have got the NASA TV.
I was wondering
Going on here, so if the president cuts in and the JWST image gets displayed, I'm just gonna stop. So how much of the interface that's there by default can you hide? So for example, if you go to the simple interface in regular JupyterLab, it takes away some of the components. How much of that could you take away if you wanted to?
Like,
You take away most of the menu and just put your own menu there?
yes. So a great example of this is the launcher, actually. I know this because Elira does this. Elira has its own launcher. So what we did is we wanted our own little class, our own bar. So if you just open up here, I'm just going to run JupyterLab real quick so you can see this. I had to reboot my computer since I was last up here, so everything's kind of rebooted. Yeah, had a feeling. Yeah. No, so in the launcher, you'll remember that there was multiple like bars, like, oh, this section, this section, this section. We wanted our own section, and we wanted it not to be at the bottom. So we extended the launcher and said, okay, this is how we want it all to be arranged, and just changed that stuff. But of course, the launcher already existed. So what you can actually do is any core extension or any third-party extension, you can just disable it, and it just won't be started. You can disable it using settings, like you can just give, there's a specific JSON file where you can just list disabled extensions, or you can actually just in the command line say JupyterLab extension disable and then list the extension. And then that extension won't start. In the case of the launcher, if you just turn it off and you open up JupyterLab, the launcher just won't be there. And in our case, we disable that in that settings file, and then we start our own launcher, and we actually give it the same name as the original launcher. So if anybody else wants to use the launcher, when they go ask for the launcher, they get our launcher because we gave it the same name and we disabled the one it came with. Similarly, you can do the same for the menu. You could do the same for sidebars. You can just disable one and insert your own. That's a very common thing, actually, is actually the launcher, disabling the launcher and putting it in your own. One of my personal projects that I've tabled for months now that I plan on doing in the second half of the year, hopefully, is to completely overhaul and refactor the launcher so you don't have to just completely disable the launcher and replace it if you want it to be customized. Because that is what you have to do right now for the launcher. We want to make it so rather than disabling the launcher, you can just say, oh, I want different stuff in it, and make it customizable like that. That's a big project that I personally plan on working on later that keeps getting tabled. It's probably not going to come in 4.0 unless 4.0 keeps getting delayed for like months and months, which I hope not. But yeah, yes, you can disable extensions. Elira is in the Elira AI org. So it's the org is Elira-AI, and then Elira is a repo in that. E-L-Y. So, yeah, it's just like the moon Elira of Jupyter, except with the Y, just like Jupyter. Yeah. You can, Luciano left, but you can thank him. Luciano named that project. Yeah. No, Elira was Luciano's brainchild when it started. But since then, a lot of the goals of Elira have actually just been subsumed by JupyterLab Core. In fact, there's a lot of functionality in Elira that the Elira team's like, well, Core would love this. Like, why don't we just give this to Core? Or such as the Python editor. And that happens all the time, is projects will donate chunks of their code to Core, or projects will be just donated to JupyterLab in general. Good example is the, what extension did we recently put in the JupyterLab org that used to be outside? Is Cell Toolbar one? I always think of the Git extension, but I think the Git extension actually always lived inside JupyterLab. Table of Context is a great example of a third-party extension that actually got it submitted to Core itself. So Table of Contents is now part of JupyterLab Core. It wasn't. You can thank Martha for that. Martha's the one who moved that into Core. I don't know who actually wrote the original, though. Yeah. Yeah, no, disabling extensions, very common, very useful. So, any other questions people want to share? General Q&A.